Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's live SBA web conference. Please note that all participant lines will be muted for the duration of this event. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit a written question, please use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. If you require technical assistance, send a private note to the event producer. I would now like to formally begin today's conference and introduce Chris Eischen. Chris, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carla. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of SBA's first Wednesday webinar series for fiscal year 2019. Before we start with our program, we want to make sure you are aware that today, at approximately 2:18 Eastern Time, you can expect to receive a presidential alert that will pop up on your cell phone. Ironically, this time coincides with our call today. The test was supposed to take place on September 20th, but apparently the President wanted to coordinate with our SBA First Wednesday session. The alert is part of FEMA's system to warn citizens in case of a national emergency. Please note that this is only a test and no action is required, so you can remain calm and fully engage in the training we have arranged for you today. On to slide 2. For today's session, we will be focusing on the non-manufacturer rule, and by the end of the program, you should have a better understanding of this topic as well as the resources available to you. If you are new to our event, this is a webinar series that focuses on getting subject matter experts on specific small business programs, in this case, the non-manufacturer rule, and having them provide you with valuable information you can use in the performance of your job as an SBA employee, a member of the Federal Acquisition Community, or a PTAC employee. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for our first session of the FY19 program, and we hope you benefit from today's session. Now for a little background on the First Wednesday program. The program was initially created for contracting staff, which is why the training was called 1102 First Wednesday. The 1102 designated government series for federal agencies increased the requirements for non-1102s to obtain DIWEA and FACSI certifications. Additionally, other federal buy-in activities, SBA staff, PTAC, and SBDC personnel who, after hearing about the training, requested access and were added to the list of participants. So that is why SBA's First Wednesday program is aimed at federal government employees and our resource partners like PTACs and SBDCs. Thank you to those of you who are repeat attendees, and welcome to those of you who are new to the program. Slide 3, as Carla mentioned, I'm Chris Eischen, and I work as a Procurement Center Representative, or better known as PCR, and I'm located in Kansas City, Missouri. Additionally, Ms. Gwen Davis, who is the PCR located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, will be reading your questions submitted during the program for our speaker to address at the end of today's session. We both work in government contracting, Area 4, and Slide 3 includes our information. So on Slide 4, please note that all lines are on mute. However, you may submit questions anytime during today's session by entering them into the chat box on your screen, and these questions will be addressed at the end of our speaker's presentation. As most of you know, we have transitioned to the WebEx application and have been informed that some users still may experience issues such as a blocked website or other error messages when attempting to access the conference login from their computers. If you are affected by this issue, please make sure you dial in and follow along with the slides provided in this email. We will ensure that page numbers are clearly stated so you can follow along. We are hopeful this issue will be resolved soon, and we apologize for any inconvenience. Now, if you are having any other technical problems, please call the AT&T support desk at the following number, 1-888-796-6118. This telephone number is also included in the email invitation for today's program and on Slide 4 of the PowerPoint presentation. Otherwise, just keep listening and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation that accompanied the invitation for today's session. As I mentioned earlier, we will continually announce the page number so you can follow along. For more SBA small business program training, please visit the SBA Learning Center at www.sba.gov. On to Slide 5. The Association of Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, or APTAC, hosts a website where they post the first Wednesday programs. Since these sessions are recorded, you can re-listen to this program as well as previous sessions by visiting their website, which is provided here on slide 5. You can also view the written transcript of today's session there as well. So Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, or PTACs, are a great resource, and partnering with your local PTAC for an industry day, and a sources sought, and RFI notices, or referring small business concerns to a PTAC are just a few reasons why they are such a useful resource for acquisition personnel. Please contact your local PTAC for additional information. Now, slide 6 is our calendar of training sessions. It looks pretty bare right now, but it's a schedule for fiscal year 2019, and today's session on understanding the non-manufacturer rule is the first topic in the series. As you will see, there are several topics that need to be filled, and we are working diligently to get you the best possible training experience. We plan to cover a couple new topics as well as provide new guidance on other areas that have been presented in the past, so you won't want to miss it. We plan to have a complete schedule established by our next session, which is on November 7th. So I'm sure many of you will want to receive credit for today's training. So on slide 7, you'll be happy to know that today's session is worth 1 CLP. On the following slide, which is slide 8, you will find the training certificate. First, you will manually fill in your name and then print the certificate from the PowerPoint to request credit for today's session. The PowerPoint presentation was part of the SBA email invitation that you received for today's session. SBA does not track your CLPs or communicate with your training program regarding your CLP achievements. Now, several of you may have received the information for this training from a friend or colleague, but if you want to receive an email directly from us notifying you of upcoming First Wednesday webinar events, just send us an email at SBA Learning, so that's SBALEARNING @sba.gov. In the subject line, please enter the words Add to List, and we'll ensure that you're added to the distribution list. And I was just mentioning slide 8 is the actual certificate that you'll print out. First, you will need to access the PowerPoint presentation that was emailed to you. Then you will manually fill in your name where it states, insert your name here. Next, within the print settings, you can select Print Current Slide, which will allow for only the certificate to be printed. And another reminder, please note that SBA does not track your CLPs or communicate with your training program regarding your CLP achievements. Now on to slide 9. Today's training has been assembled to address the non-manufacturer rule, as well as provide you with the resources available for your use. Our speakers have graciously accepted our invitation, and they will be directing me to continue on to the next slide. As mentioned earlier, if you are unable to access the WebEx application, please follow along with the PowerPoint presentation that was provided in the email for today's training. We will identify the page number so you can follow along. Also, please note that due to connectivity issues, some viewers may experience a delay as the slide changes on your screen. Now, I am pleased to introduce today's speakers to you, Mr. Sam Lee, who is an attorney advisor for SBA's Office of General Counsel, and Ms. Carol Hume, who is a program analyst for SBA's non-manufacturer rule. Carol and Sam, we appreciate that you could meet with us today, and I'll turn the program over to you now.
Appreciate it very much, Chris. Thanks very much for introducing us, and thanks everybody on the call for attending today. This is an important but sometimes complex issue, and we are very happy to be able to share our knowledge of the non-manufacturer rule with you. It's an important component of SBA small business programs and our set-aside program. So to introduce myself again, Sam Lee. I'm with SBA's Office of General Counsel. I'm at SBA headquarters in Washington, D.C. With me here in SBA headquarters is Carol Hume. She's with the Office of Government Contracting and works on non-manufacturer issues, including waivers of the non-manufacturer rule. Next slide, slide 10. Today we'll be going over the non-manufacturer rule in general, and then how the non-manufacturer rule applies to SBA programs, including small business set-asides under FAR Part 19. Then Carol will explain how contracting officers can request individual waivers for the non-manufacturer rule and how SBA goes about processing those waivers. There are also special rules for certain types of procurements, like multi-item procurement, that we'll go over in that section as well. And then after the individual waiver section, we'll discuss class waivers to the non-manufacturer rule, where the waivers can apply to particular industries or classes of products. Slide 11. So first we'll jump into the non-manufacturer rule, what it is generally, and where it applies. Slide 12. The purpose and definition of the non-manufacturer rule is up there on the slide. The non-manufacturer rule allows an otherwise responsible business concern to be awarded a procurement contract to supply a product, even though it is not the manufacturer or processor of the product, as long as it meets certain conditions. For those of you who are familiar with SBA's small business set-aside program, you probably have heard of the limitations on subcontracting. The limitation on subcontracting, sometimes called the 50% rule, applies to supplies and services. The non-manufacturer rule is an exception to the limitations on subcontracting. So where that purpose statement says that the firm can be awarded a procurement contract to supply a product, even though it is not the manufacturer of the product, that means the non-manufacturer allows the firm to receive the set-aside award, even though it would not satisfy the limitations on subcontracting. So that's an explanation for those of you familiar with that rule. If you're not familiar with that rule, then just keep with the purpose as stated in the slide. Slide 13, please. So the last slide mentioned conditions that apply under the non-manufacturer rule. The conditions are listed on this slide. There are 4 conditions. To qualify as a small non-manufacturer, a firm must first not exceed 500 employees. Second, it must be primarily engaged in retail or wholesale trade and normally sell the type of product that is being supplied. Third, the firm must take ownership or possession of the item in a manner consistent with industry practice. And fourth, the firm must supply the end product of a small business made in the United States, or there must be a waiver to the non-manufacturer rule. So to clarify that last bullet is an or with the 4th element, not an or to all 4 elements together. So for example, if a firm had 700 employees, so it doesn't meet the first element, but it there's a waiver to the non-manufacturer rule, that firm would not qualify. That waiver is an or, it's only an alternative for that 4th element. One more point that is kind of an advanced point on this slide that I want to make is in the 2nd element, where it requires that the firm be primarily engaged in retail or wholesale trade and normally sell the type of product being supplied. That wording of using type of product is significant there. We had previous cases where the firm didn't sell the exact product being supplied, but it sold other products within that category. That is acceptable under this rule because the regulation only requires that the firm sell the type of product, not necessarily the specific product that's being supplied under the contract. And this is looking retrospectively. So if a firm had been selling some other product within the same category previously, then it could qualify under that 2nd element for selling the particular product at issue in the contract. Moving on to slide 14. The SBA has a definition of manufacturer, and that's important for 2 reasons. The first reason, which is not at issue in this slide. The first reason is for the limitations on subcontracting, that 50% rule that applies to services and supply contracts. If it's a supply contract, the definition of manufacturer is important because that determines whether the firm qualifies as the manufacturer under the limitation of subcontracting. Under the limitation of subcontracting, the firm has to perform at least 50% of the manufacturing function for that contract. For our purposes here, the definition of manufacturer is important because it determines whether the firm has met all the elements of the non-manufacturer, including that fourth element, that the product be manufactured by a small business in the United States or that the firm receive a waiver. The definition of manufacturer is set forth in SBA's rules. You can see the citation at the bottom of the slide. And the manufacturer is the concern which performs the primary activities in transforming organic or inorganic substances, including the assembly of parts and components, into the end item that is being acquired. That definition goes on to state that firms which only perform minimal operations on the end item, or firms which add substances, parts, or components to the end item, do not qualify as the manufacturer of the item being acquired. So, as an example, if the firm is, say, taking a container, a box or something, and just painting that box or doing something to that box that is really not part of the functionality of that box, what we might call a minimal operation, that would not qualify as a manufacturer. However, that determination is contract-specific, and it may change from item to item. So it's somewhat difficult to generalize on whether a firm would qualify as a manufacturer without knowing in particular what the product is. Okay, going on to slide 15. We're going to talk about where the non-manufacturer rule applies. So we'll go on to slide 16. The non-manufacturer rule applies based on the type of small business program that the agency is using and the dollar value, the estimated dollar value of the acquisition. So for small business set-asides, the non-manufacturer rule applies above the simplified acquisition threshold. For set-asides under the 8A, service-disabled vet, women-owned, or hub zone programs, the set-aside applies, or the non-manufacturer rule applies above the micro-purchase threshold. Excuse me, I just saw the alert come through. The non-manufacturer rule only applies against a manufacturing or supply contract, so it does not apply to service contracts or to construction contracts. And the non-manufacturer applies depending on those dollar thresholds. And I want to note that the dollar thresholds that are reflected in this slide are the dollar thresholds from SBA's regulations, that 13 CFR 121.406 at the bottom. There are different dollar thresholds in the FAR and in the FAR clauses. I understand that the FAR is working on harmonizing the FAR regulations to SBA's rules. SBA's rules are more current in keeping with the statute and in keeping with regulatory changes, so our slide today reflects the SBA regulations. The FAR regulations, if you were to look at FAR 19, have particular specific dollar thresholds, not just the simplified acquisition threshold, micro-purchase threshold as we have on this slide, but the FAR has a particular dollar amount, and SBA recently changed our regulations to just like the simplified acquisition threshold and micro-purchase threshold into the reg. So agencies at this point have potentially varying simplified acquisition thresholds, potentially varying micro-purchase thresholds depending on the agency and depending on the type of procurement. So we decided at SBA just to use the term rather than setting forth a specific dollar threshold. Okay. Going on to slide 17. So more on the dollar thresholds here. The non-manufactural applies above the micro-purchase threshold for set-aside awards under those socioeconomic programs. That's the 8A, HUB-Zone, Women-Owned, and Service-Able Vet contracts, all of which are conducted under FAR Part 19. The non-manufactural applies to small business set-aside awards, which are small business set-asides outside of the socioeconomic program, what you might just call a total small business set-aside rather than, 8A or Service-Able Vet. The non-manufactural applies to small business set-aside awards above the simplified acquisition threshold. As you probably know, the simplified acquisition threshold in the FAR is $150,000, was recently raised by statute to $250,000, and many agencies have deviated from the FAR to implement that statutory change, but you would want to check with your agency in particular to see if your agency has deviated so that the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000. Under SBA's rules, the outcome of these two different thresholds is that the non-manufactural does not apply to small business set-asides between the micro-purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold, but it would apply to a socioeconomic set-aside if the estimated contract value is between those thresholds. And also the non-manufactural does not apply to small business subcontracts. For example, a subcontract from a large prime to a small business sub, and also does not apply to full and open contracts. On to slide 18. So one of the points that we made earlier is the non-manufactural only applies to supply contracts. I mean, it doesn't apply to service contracts or construction contracts. That's the general rule. This slide provides more specificity as to how to decide whether a contract is subject to non-manufactural. The non-manufactural only applies to those acquisitions within the NAICS codes that are designated as manufacturing and supply acquisitions. Those are those 3 series NAICS codes, 31 and through 33 in the NAICS code chart. SBA has also issued by regulation guidance that the non-manufactural applies to software, but not to subscription or remote software. Some people might refer to it as cloud software. We consider subscription software to be a service, but if you are purchasing software outside of a subscription or remote, perhaps on a CD or on a perpetual downloadable license, we consider that to be a supply, and we would apply the non-manufactural to that acquisition of the supply. Then also there's a NAICS code that is within the services category. It's that 541519 exception, the footnote 18, that is designated for information technology value-added resellers, or ITVARs, and that NAICS code exception is an exception for supply contracts. So we apply the non-manufactural to that exception as well. And the way that you can tell that you're using the exception is the exception, that footnote 18, has a different size standard than the other general 541519 contract. If you're using the exception for ITVAR, that has a 150 employee size standard, whereas if you were going to use just the regular 541519, you would be using $27.5 million receipt size standard. So to make it simple to apply, if you're using that 150 employee size standard under 541519, the non-manufactural applies. Now, as a further point of clarification, we previously said that the non-manufactural requires that the firm have 500 employees or less. Well, this ITVAR size standard has a 150 employee size standard. So we would apply that 150 employee size standard rather than the 500 employee size standard. Slide 19, please.
Okay. I'm going to talk about individual waivers. I actually process the waivers that come into the office, and so I'm going to go over what needs to be submitted in order to obtain a waiver. So individual waivers apply only to the specific solicitation. So it's a one-time waiver, and it applies to the specific item identified in the waiver request. Okay, so what you have to show is that no small business manufacturer or processor can reasonably be expected to supply the product meeting the specifications of the solicitation. Okay, the request must come from the contracting officer, and it has to include 8 elements that you'll see on the following page. Right now, I'm on page 21. And additional guidance as to how to submit these waivers and about the process can be found in the SOP 6007. Going on to page 22, we're listing the 8 elements that have to be provided in a request for a waiver. And the first one, obviously, it has to be signed, and signed by the contracting officer. The proposed solicitation number or other ID should be included, the estimated dollar amount of the contract, as well as the NAICS code for the solicitation, a brief statement of the procurement history of the item, and for contracts over $500,000, you have to provide a statement of work or the equivalent. You also have to provide a definitive statement of the item or items to be waived, as well as a justification as to why they're required. In addition, a narrative describing market research and supporting documentation must be provided. Okay. The detailed statement of the items. I am on page 23. So SBA needs the items sought under the solicitation to be described in terms of their qualities and attributes. So you can do this using layman terms or technical terminology. However, if the primary reason for narrowing sources is to obtain a brand name item, SBA generally will not issue a waiver unless the contracting officer provides a limited sources justification showing a legitimate need for the brand name item. So really you need to explain why the item is essential. Going on to page 24. Okay, sorry, page 25. So of the 8 elements mentioned, market research, which was mentioned last, is actually the most important. And SBA needs to see a narrative, a statement that provides reasonable certainty that there are no small business manufacturers that make and could supply the items sought. So the contracting officer has to perform extensive market research and provide a clear description of that market research. And examples of the tools that are commonly used are issuing sources sought notices, and that should include language or put on alert small businesses that this is a solicitation that they could be interested in. They also look at DSBS, SAM searches. They conduct industry days and roundtable discussions, direct correspondence with small businesses, that you found through sources, SOAR, RFIs, OSDBUs, or past procurements may be helpful. And if it's a repetitive acquisition and based on sufficient and recent market research showing there's no change in the marketplace, that would be good to show that you've met the adequate market research. Okay, page 27. In most cases, the sources sought notice is the most effective market research tool as it reaches a broader community. SBA requires that a sources sought notice includes language specifically seeking small business manufacturers and defines items in terms of salient characteristics. In addition, SBA prefers that these notices be posted for at least 14 calendar days. Okay, notice of the waivers. Potential offers must be notified of class or individual waivers at the time of the solicitation. However, this can be done after the solicitation if potential offers are afforded additional time to respond. Moving on to slide 29, which is multiple item procurement.
Okay, and I'll take over here, but before I get into multiple item procurement, I want to highlight the chat statement that the producer made. We made some updates to the slide deck after it was sent out to everybody, particularly with the thresholds. And if you want to get an updated slide deck that includes that newly updated threshold slide, please email sbalearning@sba.gov. Okay, so we're going to talk about multi-item procurement. And before we do that, I do want to take a step back and clarify that the reason for these waivers is that the agency does not have or cannot find a small business producer. If you recall, the non-manufacturer has 4 items, 4 requirements, and the 4th requirement is that the non-manufacturer provide the product of a small business that's made in the United States. If there are no small businesses that manufacture the item, then the agency can seek the waiver, and that's the reason that we require this market research for showing that there is not a small business manufacturer for that particular product. So in slide 29, there's a summary there of how SBA handles multi-item procurement. This is a fairly recent innovation for SBA's regulations. Previously, it was thought that if you have 3 items, for example, on your contract, A, B, C, and a firm wanted to qualify as a non-manufacturer, it would have to qualify for each of those items. It would have to provide the product of a small business and made in the United States for items A, B, and C. Well, we have now recognized in the non-manufacturer rule that the non-manufacturer operates on an item-by-item basis, and a waiver is not necessary for every item that's manufactured by a large business in a multi-item procurement. But the second point there is important as well. If the agency, the contracting agency, is about to issue a solicitation that has a non-manufacturer waiver, the agency should identify in the solicitation what items are covered by that waiver. And as I explain the multi-item procurement rule more, you'll see why that's the case. Slide 30, please. Okay, so here's the new rule. The rule is at least 50% of the total estimated contract value must be manufactured by a small business or receive a waiver. So, for example, in that scenario with A, B, and C, let's say they're all the same dollar amount, a small business could qualify as a non-manufacturer even if it provides C from a small business if it provides A and B from small business manufacturers located or manufactured in the United States. So we've taken the non-manufacturer rule from a 100% rule now to a 50% rule for multi-item procurement. And if a business could qualify if it provides over 50% of the contract value by large business, as long as some of those products are covered by waivers. So the idea there is you can kind of mix and match small business manufacturing with waivers. So let's say A, B, and C again. If you have A from a small business and you get B covered by a waiver, then the waiver means that a large business could provide that product because you've now waived the non-manufacturer rule. Then C could still be provided by a large business without a waiver because you've now satisfied that 50% rule. And if you have a multi-item procurement that involves a firm that is a manufacturer and it also is providing products as a non-manufacturer, we apply the size standard of the manufacturer. If you look at our, to clarify that, if you look at our size standards table, the manufacturing size standards are generally listed by employee numbers, and some of those employee numbers are different from 500. They might be 750 or 1,000 or 1,500. So if you have a firm that's both the manufacturer and the non-manufacturer, you would use the size standard that's listed on the table, which might not be 500 employees, whereas if a firm is just a non-manufacturer, it's subject to that 500 employee size standard. That is the first element of the non-manufacturer rule. Okay, slide 31, please. Okay, so here's some examples we can walk through for a multi-item procurement. First, you have a contract that has a total value of $1 million, and the small business is going to provide $500,000 of supplies manufactured by a small business. Here, the small business complies with the non-manufacturer rule because 50% of the total contract value is being manufactured by a small business, and there's no waiver required because that non-manufacturer is compliant with the small business non-manufacturer rule without even needing a waiver. Example 2, again, you have a contract with a total value of $1 million. $200,000 of that is manufactured by a small business, and the contracting officer obtains non-manufacturer waivers for $200,000 of the remaining value. So here, $200,000 is manufactured by a small business. That must mean that $800,000 is being manufactured by other than small business, or perhaps being manufactured outside the United States. In that case, in example 2, the firm that is seeking the contract does not comply with the non-manufacturer rule because of the $800,000 that's not covered by the non-manufacturer, only 25% is manufactured by a small business. Essentially, you have to get over that 50% threshold. Here, they've only gotten to 40%, $400,000. Example 3, total contract value again, $1 million. $300,000 is manufactured by a small business, and the contracting officer obtains non-manufacturer waivers for $400,000 of the remaining value. And this complies with the non-manufacturer rule. Of the $600,000 not covered by a non-manufacturer rule waiver, 50% is manufactured by small business. Okay, going on to slide 32. We're going to talk about class waivers to non-manufacturer rule. Slide 33, please. So a class waiver is a different category of waivers. We talked about an individual waiver is a contract-specific waiver. A class waiver is justified where there's no small business manufacturers that are first available to participate, that second are in the federal market, and third are manufacturing that class of products. Next slide, please, slide 34. So the class product, we again look back to the NAICS table, and we refer to a subdivision within the NAICS table. So class waivers will have a NAICS code associated with the code. We generally list the class waivers using a combination of the NAICS code and the PFC, and we also identify the class of products. So when you see the class waiver table, it'll have the 6-digit NAICS, the 4-digit PFC, and then a description of the product that's being waived. So it might be rubber tires or something to that effect. So it'll have the NAICS, it'll have the PFC, and then a short description of the product. Next slide, please. Slide 35. The available to participate factor or element means that the small business contractors have performed, been awarded, or submitted an offer on a federal government contract for that class of products within the last 24 months. And that means any small business. So if you have just one small business manufacturer that's been awarded a government contract for that class of business or for that class of products over the previous 24 months, then SBA will deny the class waiver request. Slide 36, please. Here are the procedures for requesting and establishing a class waiver. Anybody can request a class waiver. It could be a government agency or a business or an association or an individual. They can make a request to SBA to consider a class waiver for a class of products. And all we require is that the class waiver include a statement of the class of products to be waived, and we prefer that to be in the same format as we issue the class waiver, so that's the NAICS code, the PSC, and the description. And we require that there be information, detailed information on the efforts to identify domestic small business manufacturers for the class of products. Slide 37, please. Once SBA receives the request for waiver, SBA will perform its own market research to determine whether or not there has been a small business manufacturer that's been awarded a government contract for that product within the last 2 years. And if no small business manufacturer is found by SBA, then SBA will publish a notice in the Federal Register and an FBO announcing our intent to establish a class waiver, and then we'll provide for a public comment period of at least 15 days, and oftentimes it's much longer than that. And then we'll see if there are any comments. So, for example, we might receive a comment that, oh, actually, there is a small business manufacturer out there, or we'll receive comments saying perhaps someone has looked for small business manufacturers and not found any. So at the end of receiving those comments, SBA will provide a final notice stating whether or not SBA found small business manufacturers and determining whether or not there should be a class waiver granted. Next slide, please. Slide 38. SBA does not have any time limitations on class waivers. There are class waivers issued from the 1980s that are still in effect today because there have been no new small business manufacturers that have popped up in that particular industry. But we do publish all our class waivers on our website, and you can find them in the Federal Register as well. If there is the introduction of a small business manufacturer in an industry, then SBA will consider terminating that class waiver. We'll go through that same Federal Register process of publishing in the Federal Register an intent to terminate the class waiver, providing a public comment period, and then issuing a Federal Register notice. Recently went through that process for rubber gloves and terminated the class waiver for rubber gloves after finding that there was a small business manufacturer of that. Slide 39. As you can see, the SBA class waivers are available at SBA's website at that URL. You can check that URL for the most current list of class waivers, and you can use that to apply the non-manufacturer rule to your procurement. Again, if there's a class waiver available for a product, the agency does not have to request an individual waiver from SBA. That class has already been determined. There's no small business manufacturer, so SBA has conclusively waived the fourth element of the non-manufacturer rule for that class of products. And make sure to keep track of the class waiver terminations such as rubber gloves, as I mentioned, and always check the list for up-to-date effective class waivers before issuing a small business set-aside on supply contracts. Slide 40, please. So this slide applies both to the individual waivers and to the class waivers. Instructions on how to submit NMR waiver requests. You can submit them by email to nmrwaivers@sba.gov, and please include your market research in that email, whether it be an individual waiver. For individual waivers, we request that you provide a solicitation number and agency abbreviation in the subject line so that we can make sure to keep your waiver requests separate from other ones that we receive. And then for class waivers in the subject line, please include the NAICS code, the PSC, and the description of the product. So again, that we can keep those separate from other types of waiver requests that we get. Slide 41, please. So here, continuing on the procedure on how to submit NMR waiver requests, if you have a individual waiver granted, not talking about class waivers, but individual waivers from SBA, that waiver applies to a one-time award. So if you go back out, what that means is if you go back out under a separate solicitation, separate award for that product, you would again have to request a waiver and get a waiver granted by SBA. In other words, the individual waiver is not like a class waiver. It does not apply to every award under that product. And the waiver also does not apply to modifications that are outside the scope of the contract or to other procurement actions. The effect of the waiver is that it allows an otherwise qualified small business to supply the product of an other than small or large manufacturer processor on a small business set-aside contract or contract under one of those 4 programs, 8A, WSB, SBVO, or Hub Zone. The SBA does not have authority over the Buy American Act or the Trade Agreements Act, so the waiver of the non-manufacturer rule does not waive those other legal requirements, the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreements Act. All that we are waiving when we issue a waiver is an exception to the 4th element of the non-manufacturer rule. Next slide, please. Okay, and that concludes our formal presentation for today, and we welcome any questions that you might have.
And Gwen, I'll give you a minute. I know there's quite a few questions out there. Sam and Carol, thanks for providing a great presentation here today. Like I mentioned, Gwen will be coordinating all those questions and getting those out. Gwen, are you ready?
Yep, I am. I have 11 so far. Most of them pertain to slide 17. The basic question that I've gotten from several people is they need clarification on the non-manufacturer rule not applying to 8A Hub Zone, SDVOSB, and WOSB programs. Can we maybe go over that?
Sure. So the non-manufacturer rule, sure. So thank you for putting slide 17 back up on there. The non-manufacturer rule applies to all of SBA's programs, but there are exceptions below certain dollar thresholds, and the exceptions depend on which program the agency is using. Let me first caveat this by stating that these are the rules that are in SBA's regulations, that 13 CFR 121.406. These exceptions are not yet reflected in the FAR. So if you look at the FAR has separate dollar thresholds from what is in SBA's regulations. However, SBA's regulations are more up-to-date and keeping with more current regulatory and statutory changes. So let me go through how this works by program. For the socioeconomic programs, which are 8A, service-able vet-owned under SBA's rules, Hub Zone, and the women-owned small business and economically disadvantaged women-owned small business, the non-manufacturer rule applies above the micro-purchase threshold. So essentially no threshold exception for those programs. If the agency has issued a small business set-aside that is not in one of those programs, that's to say that any small business is eligible to bid on that small business set-aside, what agencies often refer to as a total small business set-aside. In that case, the non-manufacturer has an exception between the micro-purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. So that means that the non-manufacturer rule applies above the simplified acquisition threshold for a small business set-aside, but does not apply below the simplified acquisition threshold. I did not mention this previously, and I just want to make this point because I think it has led to some confusion. The non-manufacturer also applies to set-aside task orders. That's clear in SBA's rules that the non-manufacturer applies to set-aside contracts, and it applies to set-aside task orders.
Okay. Somebody asked about the interpretation of difference between a software subscription and a perpetual license. That was one of the exceptions.
Okay.
Page 18.
Okay. Okay. So the rule here, let's find this rule so I can be more specific. Generally, what we say is that software as a service is not subject to non-manufacturer because it's not a supply contract. I'll read you the exact rule. It says, subscription services, remote hosting of software data or other applications on servers or networks of a party other than the U.S. government are considered by SBA to be services and not the procurement of a supply item. Therefore, SBA will not grant waivers of the non-manufacturer for these types of services. But generally, SBA would consider software that is not a service to be a supply item. I suppose the example I gave was a perpetual license of software, where you're not buying by subscription. There might be other examples as well. You might have a shorter term than perpetual that could still be considered a supply but would not be considered a subscription service. In that situation, you may want to contact us to see whether it fits into that subscription service category or it fits into the general categorization of software as a supply. And if you want to see the actual regulatory description, it's in SBA's rules at 121.1203D, as in David, 3.
The next question is, does a sole source award to a small business concern meet the definition of a small business set-aside, and does NMR apply to those sole source awards under FAR Part 6.3?
No. Well, if the justification for the sole source award is that there's only one responsible source, then that's not an acquisition conducted under SBA's program, so it wouldn't be subject to the non-manufacturer rule. However, if the justification is that the agency is using, the 8A sole source authority or the hub zone sole source authority or service table vet sole source authority, then that would be under SBA's programs and it would be subject to non-manufacturer. But if you're just doing the only one responsible source under FAR Part 6, that's not an SBA procedure, so you would not have to apply the non-manufacturer rule in that instance.
Next question is, does SBA ever make an individual waiver a class waiver, and if so, under what circumstances would it do that?
I can take this one. I believe if we had enough requests for a certain type, then that would spark the request for a class waiver, which anyone could apply for. But I've personally not had that happen. I don't know if that's happening yet. Do you want to take a chance, maybe, clarify it?
Yeah, I think that's right. If we continuously got individual waiver requests for a particular type of product, then we could initiate our own class waiver proceeding by publication in the Federal Register and the Federal Business Opportunities website.
We had a couple of questions on slide 38 regarding the termination of an existing NMR waiver.
Mm-hmm.
If there's only one small business that manufactures, how does that help the agencies meet that rule of two?
Yeah, so those are two separate requirements. One is, under our authority, we cannot grant a waiver if there's a small business manufacturer that's out there. And if there is one small business manufacturer on the agency side, then the agency might not find that the rule of two is satisfied. So certainly, if there is only one small business manufacturer, the agency would be justified in finding that the rule of two is not met.
Okay.
Those two requirements are, don't necessarily have to do with one another.
Okay. Next question is for a waiver. What if market research has small businesses that say they could develop the item if given time, but they currently do not make or supply the item?
Then that would go to their experience, and the contracting officer would evaluate whether that manufacturer could actually meet. But there has to be a history of being able to meet such solicitations. They can't just say they're going to do it or they plan to do it. There has to be more to it than that. They have to have some experience.
Okay. Next question is, does NMR normally apply under valid emergency situations if there's no small businesses that can provide it? Can the contracting officer proceed without coordination with the SBA?
No, SBA has to. I think the question is, can the contracting officer waive the NMR without SBA's cooperation? And the answer to that is no. SBA has to be able to review the waiver request and provide a determination on whether the requirement is waived. Now, if it's a small business set aside and you don't need a waiver because there is a small business manufacturer out there, then you don't need to coordinate with SBA. The firm that is providing the product, if it provides the product of a small business, has satisfied the rule, and there's no need for a waiver.
Okay. I have two more questions. One is regarding the NASA SOUP contracts and the Army chess contracts. Does the NMR apply when making purchases on those mandatory contracts?
I'm not familiar with chess. I think NASA SOUP is under that IT value-added reseller exception that we discussed, the 150 employee. But NASA SOUP, at least the one that is coming to an end soon, I believe, was issued before SBA decided to apply the non-manufacturer rule to IT value-added resellers. So it was essentially non-manufacturer did not apply because SBA's rule didn't apply to IT value-added resellers at the time that NASA issued that SOUP contract. I think NASA is coming out with another SOUP, and I don't know what the NAICS code and what the status is on the follow-on SOUP. And chess, I'm not familiar with that contract, so I'm not sure.
Okay. That's a program where the Army buys all of their IT hardware and software, and there's it's a multiple award contract, but it's mandatory for DOD to make their purchases off of that.
So I think generally what we would consider is, first, what's the NAICS code on the order? If the NAICS code is a supply NAICS code, then the non-manufacturer would apply. If the order is set aside for a small business. So, if it's a full and open order, then the non-manufacturer will not apply. It only applies to SBA's programs. But certainly the non-manufacturer applies at the order level if it was set aside at the order level.
Next question, does the NMR apply to leased equipment contracts over this Act?
Generally, we consider leases to be services, but it depends on the NAICS code. If there's a lease NAICS code, it's probably a service NAICS code, and the NMR would not apply. But if the NAICS code is a supply NAICS code, then we would apply the NMR. It's more what NAICS code the contract is classified under than it is, the description of the contract.
Okay, and one more question came in. It's referencing a specific NAICS code, 324191, petroleum, lubricating oil and grease manufacturing. Mm-hmm. They're wondering if that NMR rule applies to that. Would that be something that would be on the class waiver list? And if so, we've had a couple questions come in that the list that's online is from 2015. Is there a new list?
There's not a new list. We haven't granted a class waiver in some time, although we've terminated class waivers, but we haven't granted one in a while. I'm not familiar with the list and whether it has that particular NAICS code.
I'm not.
So we'd have to follow up on whether that particular item is on the waiver list.
Okay. And I've got a bunch more that are still coming in. Chris, how are we doing for time?
We are just a minute past, but if you got time to do a couple more, let's do it.
Sure, that's fine.
Perfect.
Okay. Here's one. Do you recommend non-manufacturers to include a manufacturing NAICS code in their SAM registration?
Yeah, they should do that.
Could a business apply for an NMR exception related to a specific NAICS anytime or only during an open solicitation?
For a class waiver, you can submit that at any time, but for an individual waiver, we only accept individual waiver requests from agencies, not from businesses.
Okay. Let's see. Here's one. Would a business that is a one-man woman/woman office that just has a phone and a computer and does not handle the products at all be considered for NMR? There is an agency that procures food products, and there are a lot of businesses like that.
I think we'd have to know more about the industry practice in that category. The non-manufacturer rule says that the business must take possession or ownership consistent with industry practice. We usually refer to the agency to tell us what the industry practice is, but if the practice is that that's common in that industry to do that, then it possibly could qualify under the non-manufacturer rule.
It looks like that's it. I haven't seen any new ones coming in. So I think that's all for the questions.
Okay, and if for some reason there was a question that somebody had asked and it hadn't been answered or you want more clarification, you can feel free to reach out to us at SBA Learning at SBA.gov. It's a slide that's currently up right now. Or feel free to reach out directly to Carol, and her email address is on slide 42, or if you're looking at the screen, it's here as well. Carol and Sam, I want to thank you guys for having a great presentation and answering all the questions that we did have. So once again, thank you, and thank you for all those who are on the line as well, and hopefully have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's conference. The session has now concluded, and you may disconnect.